And we're live. It is Monday, February 21st, 2022. I think it is day zero of the year zero in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Democratic Republics. It is 5 o'clock Eastern time. It is, I think, midnight or 1 a.m. Estonian time. Is that right, Thomas?
Midnight.
It is 2 p.m. California time, where Tim Miller is here, but not visible. He's trying a different computer. He'll be back in a second. And we are not allowed to have fun anymore. And the people of Ukraine are really not allowed to have fun anymore. We were scheduled to chat with Tim in our usual kind of lighthearted way, but things then got a little heavy. So I asked Thomas to join us as well. And Thomas, let's start with you. How ugly is it, and how much hope, if any, should we hold out that this is all just a bluff and we will return to normal and our regularly scheduled programming shortly?
Well, Putin gave a speech that perhaps only, I hate to say this, but only Adolf Hitler could have given, justifying invading Ukraine, because historically the people of Ukraine have always really been Russian. And it's how everyone and everybody in Ukraine is criminal. Everyone who supported independence is criminal. That all of the countries of the Soviet Union are all fake, and they all really belong to the Russian Empire that was unfairly destroyed, first by Lenin, and then by Stalin, and then culminating in the independence of all of these countries in 1991. Bad.
And to be clear, it's bad because it implies immediate action to reabsorb all or part of Ukraine and long-term ambition to reabsorb other former Soviet republics.
Well, it was the speech of a madman. I mean, it was just out to lunch, which is, I think, the universal opinion of it. You can watch it on YouTube in English, and you just sit there and this is crazy.
Yeah, I mean, he really, the part of it that I was stunned by was his sort of irritation at Lenin for the creation of these ethnic republics within the great Russian Empire. I mean, it just had this kind of 100-year-old, and then the commies fucked everything up. We had a perfectly good empire here. It was, Russians beat up on ethnic minorities. And then, first Lenin and Stalin came and created these fake internal borders. And then, gosh, they turned out to be real. It's such an injustice. It would be like a British prime minister, complaining about the idea that the Raj had a kind of an independent borders, right?
Well, I was struck by the similarity to those televised Trump cabinet meetings, and just like the way that he dressed around the folks who did not give the answer the correct way, and everyone had to praise him so effusively. But while we have Thomas, I was interested in his response. Have you seen the video that Senator Chris Murphy put out? It's pretty interesting. I'll do my best to summarize it. He argues that Putin is playing a very weak hand, and that we should, be interpreting the situation in that context, which is that basically, Putin has kind of set himself up as promising this sort of reunification of various sort of Russian ethnic, groups and territories. But the Ukrainians basically rejected him. So have some of the other of your former neighbors in Estonia. And now he's forced to either engage in what would likely be a pretty catastrophic for Russia invasion or back down. And it was, I guess, the best way to put a rose-colored glasses on the situation. I'd be interested in your take on that.
Well, I'll follow what another, in lieu of fun, guest, Dmitry Alperovich said. This is going to be bloody, 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 and brutal, with the same kind of tactics employed in Chechnya, and he calculates massive casualties. Putin himself confirmed the U.S. intelligence report that they had kill lists, saying this evening, our time, that, well, we have lists and we have all these people who are accountable for crimes. So, I mean, it's going to be bad. And I just read how some Ukrainian mothers are putting their children's blood type on their winter coats, so in case something happens to them. I mean, they are going, if they do an air war and they bomb, it's going to mean tens of thousands of casualties, if not more. And the problem is that if we look at the behavior of the Russian military, be it in Syria, in Chechnya, probably, though we don't know who was firing, but in Kazakhstan just a couple of weeks ago. I mean, peaceful protest is not going to be tolerated. They will simply open fire. And so that's how what their so-called pacification looks like. And so that's the big fear, is massive civilian casualties on top of the, if not numerical, at least the vast superiority and weaponry of the Russian military, which is, I mean, they've put so much money in the past 10 years to modernize that they may not have they don't have that many troops, and they don't have the discipline, but they have incredibly effective weapons, and that's what the fear is.
So we have actually two experts here for the question that I want to ask, which is, Tomas, what is obviously public opinion is not a monolith, but what is the basic temperature of the Russian domestic audience for something like what you're describing? And then also, Tim, where do you think the Republican Party is going to go if our fears are borne out?
Well, the Russian public has been kind of looked at this and not really thought it would happen. The state media has been absolutely hysterical. Absolutely. I mean, the Ukrainians are completely dehumanized as dogs and vermin and all this other stuff, and it's really awful. But at the same time, it seemed that no one believed this would happen. And even some of the most sort of looking at some of the Western correspondents or expats there who were constantly tweeting, "Oh, nothing's going to happen, are kind of shocked right now. They're not going to have too many conscripts there because they have so many sort of contract soldiers, as they're called, who get paid a fair bit of money to fight. So you won't have the same kind of public reaction with a lot of, Afghanistan, you had, these people coming back, bodies coming back. There will be bodies, but they will not, it's not the same thing as having kids conscripts coming back. I say on the Republican Party, I don't know what it's like in the US, but certainly the Republicans at Munich this weekend were quite pro-Ukrainian and anti-Putin, including Lindsey Graham. So it'll
But
be.
that's kind of a self-selected sample, right? If you're a CPAC Republican, you didn't go to Munich.
Yeah. I mean, my take on the Republicans is there's two levels, right? At the first level, the Republican position will be whatever Biden does is bad, right? So, I think there will be unanimity within the party on that. I think some people will probably criticize them for not doing enough and some for doing too much, but they'll have unity on the fact that he was wrong. What is below that, the divide, I think, is more interesting. And Tomas hits on this. The establishment DC Republican crowd, which ranges from everybody from, Mitt, who is basically hostile to Trump, all the way over to like McCarthy, or someone who is pretty pro-Trump. That whole range of the establishment is going to be, decently bellicose, not wanting to put troops on the ground, but wanting to have as aggressive of a response as possible that is anti-Putin. Then among the elites, there's a rump group of, pure MAGAs, your Peter Thiel crowd, like Masters, Vance, Hawley, etc., Tucker. They are going to be, we should do nothing, we shouldn't care about this. I sense that they have the majority among rank and file Republicans. Like if you actually had to have a referendum on this at the Iowa caucuses, I think that the Hawley position would win out over the McConnell position. And this is another example of why Trump took over the party in the first place, because he has this kind of reptilian animal instinct for where the base voter is, that is when it's, and where that's in conflict with the old guard.
So on that point, I tend to agree with you that there's, that this is related to the sort of, the border stuff where there's a Republican establishment position that's very centrist and bipartisan, and then there is the actual views of base Republican voters, which consistently manages to shock the establishment. I have been somewhat surprised by Mitch McConnell, who seems to have outflanked that consensus a little bit from the left, or at least from the bipartisan establishment side. He's refused to criticize the administration. He's basically said he thinks the president is handling this pretty well. What do you think he's trying to do here, given that he never does anything without a cunning set of reasons?
That's a good question. I haven't thought that deeply about McConnell's posture on this. My instinct says that McConnell does not really see this as a relevant issue as it relates to whether he's going to be the majority leader next year, unless it's a worst case scenario type situation about what happens in Europe, and it destabilizes the whole, in our domestic political status. And so he probably is, if you look at what McConnell's actions, even during the Trump era, on the main political issues, he would stop to Trump. On the issues that are kind of beltway issues that didn't really matter that much to voters, a lot of times he would go separate from Trump and, and advance kind of traditional, Reagan type Republican views. And I think that's what's happening here. And I think that if it becomes a campaign issue, then you'll see McConnell start to tactically moving towards the critiquing Biden, et cetera, as we move into the summer. That's my instinct.
But meanwhile, I'll say that Zhirinovsky the other day predicted war would begin at 4 a.m. on the 22nd of February, 4 a.m. is, well, in Ukraine time is in 3.5 hours. But I don't know if maybe you're saying Moscow time, so that would be in 2.5 hours.
All right.
So, Thomas, can I ask a question? Like, is it absurd to think that this is a kind of off ramp? To think that, okay, he declared he's declared the independence of 2 Russian enclaves. The military moves in, occupies it, military flanking on in Belarus, and just maintaining the pressure without actually, bombing Kiev, because he will have accomplished what he. Well, it's very hard to know exactly what he's trying to accomplish. But
the first point is, it's not that they're moving in. He's basically just legitimated, from his point of view, the presence of the Russian troops that have been there since 2014, which is where they moved in after sort of the Donbass, the so-called separatists were getting their asses kicked, and then he moved the troops in, and that's where why the line is where it is. And if you recall, there was this horrible battle of Donetsk with all kinds of that was fought with. It was not fought by separatists or anything. That was fought by real hardcore army. So that was the first point. I mean, the question we have now is when will he recognize these entities in their current borders or in the official borders? Because what you have is, Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast are they're
about 3 times the size of their current land holdings.
And so and there are some who say, well, that means we recognize all the oblasts, but that would require war. Because it's 2/3 of the area is held by Ukraine. So that we don't know yet. And so, this is all unfolding at the moment or in the morning. But this is the other thing I wanted to raise, which I thought was kind of wimpy, is that the Biden administration announced that they would sanction the people in Donbass. They didn't do anything. They're thugs, they're mafioso, and they're warlords, but they have done nothing. This is a decision made in and by the Kremlin. And so I don't quite understand why sanctioning them at this point does anything at all, because they haven't done anything. They just got recognized. That's why sanction them. And that's
I can't tell whether Biden's reluctance for more aggressive preemptive sanctions is a ideological view held by him and his advisors and Sullivan, or whether it's kind of a sop to the other European nations that don't want more aggressive action until it's absolutely necessary. What's your take on that?
I would say that at this point, the European countries, most of them would take the lead of the United States. And I can basically imagine that the reaction in at least the eastern part of NATO and the European Union is like, what? Why are you sanctioning them? Who made the decision? The whole thing today, first the ridiculous meeting they had during the day, which was probably for your early morning, but he had his so-called Security Council meeting, and everyone stood up in turn, saying, well, we think it's time to recognize, except for the poor guy, head of the SVR, Narishkin, who said, I completely support joining these territories to Russia, whereupon Putin says, no, we're not talking about it. He didn't read the script. And also the other funny thing about it, which has been pointed out as well, is that Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, he had his watch on, but it was at a different it was like 4 hours before the official live thing they were doing. So it was quite clear. I mean, they have a history of with watches because, okay, today they did this thing that was supposedly live, but, the guy, you can see on his watch that it's 4 hours earlier. But there was also the head of the Russian Orthodox Church who had a like $600,000 gold watch a couple of years ago, and it was a picture of him with it, and then this caused a kind of brouhaha. So it was airbrushed off his wrist. But what they forgot to airbrush was the reflection of the gold watch in the very shiny table that he was at. So they got rid of the watch, but the gold watch was still reflected. So it's kind of, so I don't have problems.
So just about sanctions. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, was for a couple of years at Yale Law School, and I did talk to him a bunch about sanctions. I remember his concern at the time, and which may explain what's going on right now, is that the thing about sanctions is that you want to keep some powder dry. You want to be able to, like, once you cut everything off, you don't have anything else you can do. And so that it seemed as though, at least to me, that there was a desire to engage in incremental sanctioning, so as a way of giving incentives to the Russian Federation to not accelerate. Because if you just drop it all right now, then the argument would be, look, they're sanctioning us. Might as well just go for it. I don't know if that's naive or not, but that's what seemed to me what was happening.
That idea is good, but the problem is that the decisions, the actions, have all been from the Kremlin, and all that, and what has happened in the so-called DNR and LNR is that they have been recognized. They didn't do anything. They have not joined Russia. This is just that these statelets where there's a decision to recognize their existence. So, sanctioning them makes no sense. There's a whole range of things you can do, and you can step up, you can do all kinds of things. You don't have to hit everything all at once, so that's probably not a smart idea. Nonetheless, everything from the tech sanctions that have been talked about to the financial sanctions and the banks that can be selectively done, and then the secondary market for bonds, and that's before you even get to sanctioning people, freezing all of these government officials' salaries. Not salaries, their assets in the West, and then you get the visa bans. And then you get the visa bans for the oligarchs, and then you get the visa bans for their mistresses and for their kids going to school. You can ratchet this up, do one a week, and it'll be 6 months before you get to the full range.
Was that a secondary market for bongs?
All right. So, Tim, I want to ask you about the secondary market for bongs.
Okay.
When you
it's vibrant. There's vibrant because of the shortages, supply chain.
Yeah. So I'm interested in the domestic politics of this here. I'm going to ask Tomas about the domestic politics of it in Eastern European countries in a moment. But you started this by saying you think Mitch McConnell will be responsible unless this turns into an election issue. And right now, unlike Afghanistan, it's not really, clear that Biden made much of a choice here that had impact here. Do you think this plays badly for Biden, or do you think it's just something that happens far away that people don't give a shit about?
I think the latter, unfortunately. I wish that was not the case, but even among kind of elite environs, I'm surprised how much little care there is about what is happening here. Forget
Me too.
what happens among, kind of your average voter. Just look, bulwark traffic, for example, on Ukraine articles is not gangbusters. Okay, we're doing much better when we're writing about Steve Bannon's podcast than we're writing about what's happening in Ukraine, for better or worse. So, there's no evidence in the polls that people care about this. Now, look, obviously the wild card is if the worst case scenario that Thomas was laying out, massive bloodshed, it destabilizes other things in Europe that has, long tail effects on what's happening here. Again, I was joking earlier, but seriously, back to supply chain and other, economic impacts. Gas, oil prices continue to go up. That could have a negative effect on Biden. That's like a third order impact of this, fourth order, not the main issue. And it's hard for me to see that changing really, but especially because, as terrible as this is, there's kind of a bipartisan consensus to do nothing. And that's why when Thomas says this is sort of wimpy, well, it's wimpy because that's what the people want in our democracy. Like, they're asking for a wimpy response to this. Now, maybe that will change, but I just, don't see anything besides a very catastrophic, actions in Ukraine changing that between now and November.
Does anybody? I'm sorry. Does anybody think it's a good idea for the Americans to send troops? Or I mean, it just seems like a terrible idea. So it does. It seems as if the bipartisan consensus in this case is actually a good thing. I mean, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
No one's sending any troops to Ukraine. No NATO countries are doing. I mean, different countries are sending various forms of arms. I mean, much of Europe is doing that, except for Germany, which is sending helmets. I mean, that's the big scandal here. Is no, we're not going to send them anything to defend themselves, but we will give them helmets, and that kind of is a European kind of face palm. And to answer your question about Eastern Europe, or Europe, which is, I think there's a big divide now between the countries that stand strongly with Ukraine, and those are basically all of the East Europeans except for Hungary, and then the Brits and the Netherlands and Denmark, and then the kind of southern countries, France, Italy. They're very cautious. Germany is out of this thing completely because of the complicating factor of their two-term chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, who is probably the poster boy for corruption of European elites. He's
one of them.
Well, no, he's the poster boy. I mean, everyone else. I invented the term Schröderization as a general phenomenon. And you have, former Prime Minister of France, Fillon, the former Prime Minister of Finland, Lipponen. I mean, the former Foreign Minister of Austria. I mean, it's there's just so much of this stuff. And it's been very effective. You buy up these politicians, and then they become their high recognition lobbyists and writing articles and making speeches saying Russia's wonderful. It's become quite embarrassing for the Social Democratic Party in Germany, where, I mean, that's the leading party in the government. So there's a lot of sort of face palming there too between what Schröder says and does.
But it's not like the current chancellor is shrouding himself in glory either.
No.
And I do wonder, with respect to Eastern European opinion, you have one country, Hungary, that is essentially carved out, which is a NATO member, that is essentially carved out a completely independent position on this. How united, if the tanks roll in at 4 a.m. this morning, or the bombs start dropping at 4 a.m. this morning, how united is Europe going to be? What are the countries, like, let's say Biden goes ahead with the whole array of sanctions, and how many of the European countries are going to be on board?
Well, the big worry in countries highly dependent upon gas is that there will be retaliatory measures cutting off gas. Now, how much Russia can sustain that itself is a different question, because they're making a lot of money off the gas. So, and then in Italy and in Germany, a number of people say we don't believe in cutting off SWIFT. Maybe SWIFT even isn't the best idea anyway, because the Russians have been planning ahead for that for a while and probably have some alternative ways of doing that. On the other hand, if you sanction Sberbank, so they can't, it's the biggest bank in Russia and by far, and if Sberbank is sanctioned, they're not going to be able to do any real transactions with Europe, and that would be a pretty tough measure.
I want to push back on hippie Scott the Dove, for a second about the bipartisan consensus. I do think that there's a lot of space between, the current ambivalence, it seems like, and troops, right? And as, representing my former neocon brethren, I do think that we can have a little bit more of a cowboy attitude about this, and a more of a, I think, forward-leaning feeling about the importance of American leadership and Western leadership in the world, and sending better signals to Tomas's former country he was president of, and the other countries in the regions, that we are there, that we're going to be, supplying weapons and supplying support if this, continues to expand. I think that right now there's not a lot of fear in Moscow that they're going to get much pushback. And I think that we could be signaling that there would be more pushback than there's going to be. And so I guess that would be my critique of the bipartisan consensus.
I also think if you start off just sanctioning the people in DNR, they're all slapping their thighs saying, ha, 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 ha.
Right. They deal in baskets of cash, not in wire transfers.
Yeah, may I just jump in to say, what the United States, as the foremost economic superpower in the world, has is the ability to impose an enormous amount of pain on the Russian Federation, and to exert political pressure on Europe in order to keep that going. And it would just seem to be, to me at least, a squandering of political energy to do anything that has fingerprints on it in the kinetic space, as opposed to what OFAC is doing, because OFAC does not piss people off.
I guess
OFAC being the office, yep.
On that
office of, I'm sorry, the OFAC is the part of the Department of Treasury that imposes
Office
sanctions.
of Foreign Assets Control.
So it doesn't seem to me like the message coming from the West, from the NATO countries, is that there's going to be any appetite for suffering economic pain on our end in order to deliver it to Russia. And that is, I guess, where I just wonder the limits of the sanctions from a financial standpoint, right? That when it comes to the pipeline, when it comes to the types of things that are going to affect the global economic system, I'm not feeling that any of these countries seem like they're willing to do that in order to really squeeze the Russians. And so without knowing Putin's balance sheet or claiming to be an expert on this, I do wonder whether he's not all that worried about that.
Yeah, I just want to say I this is where the country of Germany becomes extremely important. Oil is an international market. Gas, because of the nature of pipelines, is inherently a regional market. And if the Germans want to buy a large amount of Russian gas, there is not that much that anybody can do about it. We can ask and we can make trouble for Nord Stream 2 and the like. But at the end of the day, it's very hard to prevent Russia from selling gas to a neighboring country, or a neighboring country that's, only one country away, depending on how you route the gas, that wants to buy it. And you can encumber that a bit, but there's, at the end, you can't do too much. All right, Jack Sullivan, the floor is yours.
So my question isn't terribly much focused on Ukraine, but you all were talking about the dynamic within the Republican Party. And for people who identify as Democrats, the question is what they can do to create a more responsible Republican Party other than trying to beat Republicans in elections. Given partisan polarization and the geographic sorting of people by party affiliation, there are many offices where a Republican necessarily is going to win. And the question is whether there's anything Democrats can do to affect which Republicans are electable beyond, say, crossover voting in primaries and things like that.
Tim?
Is this still on?
You're good.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So to answer that question, I mean, look, there's not a whole lot anybody can do to change who Alabama is going to elect in the Senate. I mean, I think that there are strategic options. Like if you go back to, I think it's 2014, Thad Cochran, relatively normal Republican, running in a primary against Chris McDaniel, who's basically a white supremacist. My friend Stuart Stevens, who's a Lincoln Project now, sort of helped coordinate a campaign that was traditional Republicans with mostly black voters in Alabama voting in the primary to beat, in Mississippi, to beat out McDaniel. There are going to be certain examples like that, but a lot of times there just isn't going to be anything that we can do because of the sorting that you brought up. I think that there's one thing that the Democrats can do that the Democrats are not doing right now, which they don't seem to have any interest in doing, which I don't understand, which is try to elect more Joe Manchins. And right now, the Democrats are very interested in attacking Joe Manchin and making him the enemy rather than making him a model. I think that the agenda would be much more likely to be passed if there were 5 Joe Manchins right now than 1, because you'd only need to convince 1 of the 5 of them to do the right thing. And so that's something I wish the Democrats were looking more into. Just really quick, also to Scott's thing on, and to Ben's point on the natural gas. This is, in some ways, there's the parallel to this here, right? Which is like, is there something that U.S. could do that's economic, that would lessen Russia's economic stranglehold? Well, yeah, we could start to try to figure out ways how we could import LNG from Canada and the U.S. over to Europe.
You can liquefy it.
You can't, right? But doesn't appear to be a lot of interest on that within the Democratic Party coalition in particular, because of, and these are reasonable, right? There's environmental concerns, climate concerns, but sometimes when you're looking at bad options, I would be at least interested in seeing people try to explore that.
Yeah, there's nothing worse for the environment than kinetic war, I would just point out.
So. Yeah, and also, if you're concerned about long-term climate damage, creating a modern economy in Ukraine actually matters, just in terms of it's much more likely to be heating houses with cleaner energy. Susan Brewer, the floor is yours.
Hey, I turned on the news in the middle of the day and was listening, awaiting this notification of whether or not Putin had come out to say that, this business about the breakaway regions what he was going to say about those. And that term is so disturbing. And I just wonder, if there's any hope that, the broader news media is going to get a grip on the fact that a term like that reinforces Putin's, seems to me, reinforces Putin's arguments about, and anyway, there it is.
So your question is an alternative to the term breakaway regions? How about
yes.
Russian occupied Ukrainian territory?
Well, there you go. But how, what is it with our, way that we want to balance everything that's just so destructive to making clear what's happening? We seem to be confusing ourselves while we're trying to inform ourselves, and that just seems to be a problem that's going on in a lot of places that we need to take care of.
Yeah, that's a good point. Tomas, what do you think? What is the proper terminology for the Donbas regions, and for that matter, for Crimea?
Satrapy.
I think you're going to need to unpack that.
A satrapy. That's like
a satrap. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's exactly what it says. I mean, it's like a little area that is controlled by another country, and that really is just kind of not doing too well. And it's, I mean, it's just an extension of a big power. So,
I mean, I'm curious for your thoughts on this, Scott. You're the international law scholar, and why shouldn't these just be called Russian occupied Ukrainian territory? The Russian occupied province of Crimea, the Russian occupied Donetsk and Luhansk regions.
Well, I would hope that that's what they are called, because that does seem to be.
But it isn't. They're called breakaway regions, oblasts. They're called almost anything but.
Well, because I think this goes to the issue that we talked about earlier, which was that, as Tomas said, that Russian troops have been there, but kind of covertly. But now they're there overtly. It appears, I don't read Russian, but it appears that the independence declarations also involved orders to Russian troops to go into the two regions. So insofar as that it's open now, that there's an occupation going on, then that should be the proper term rather than breakaway, especially when you could, I mean, there's the question about who the actors are here, but also there's the question about where the support is. And if you say that 2/3 of these regions are actually not in favor of the occupation, that's even a better reason not to call it breakaway. It's more like torn away.
I mean, there's one more element. I mean, Putin is in love with analogies in foreign policy. And one of the things that irks him the most was the Kosovo campaign, which followed a UN it's R2P, but that stands for Right to Protect. And so the U.S.
responsibility to protect.
Responsibility, right? Yeah, went in to protect the people protect them from the genocide perpetrated against the Kosovars. What he has now done in trying to create this is a fake evacuation of the civilian population of the Donbas. So he's basically deporting these people to as far away as Magadan and Murmansk. One is way up in the north, the Magadan's by the Pacific Ocean, saying he's protecting them from something that isn't happening, except for the men who are being called up, being conscripted from the age of 15 to 55 as cannon fodder. The other possible scenario is that following what they did, say, in Finland during the Winter War, where they had what is called the teriyaki regime, but you had basically a government, a fake government set up at a border town called Teriyaki and say that's the government of Finland, that's what we recognize. And then the rest of Finland, which is not, I mean, Finland itself is not legitimate, but we have this little government headed by Otto Kuusinen, who was a Stalinist Finn. He's the real legitimate government of Finland. Now, I mean, the thing, I mean, you can pull off, and they have pulled off things like this. You do the same thing in Ukraine, saying, well, the legitimate government of Ukraine is actually in Donetsk. I mean,
Right.
I mean, they do all these things, right? But certainly the legitimization of what they're doing right now in the Donbass is really trying to, I mean, show all of the similarities with, which don't exist, but nonetheless to make these similarities or narrative similarities with Kosovo 20 years ago.
That's really interesting. Tony, the floor is yours. I'm having trouble unmuting you, though. Can you refresh your screen? In the meantime, I will read a question from somebody who has been unable to come on screen. James Puckett, my apologies for your for being unable to get you on. James writes, Tim, I tried asking this last time and wasn't able to, so I feel it's really important that we get James's question in this time. How do you feel about the recent presidential rankings that have Obama in the top 10? Has your opinion of him changed since the last 10 plus years of the Republican Party downfall? You campaigned vigorously against him and his policies, so I was interested in your views on the matter.
Yeah, my positions on Obama haven't really changed so much as my positions on the other competitors on that presidential list have changed some. And I always said that in the Obama-McCain race 08, if I ranked every presidential possibility on a scale from like 1 to 100, you know, John McCain for me was like an 88 and Obama was like a 49. And I thought that was like a pretty big gap, right? But I still had Obama's sympathies. Obviously, there were certain issues I agreed with him on. I thought it was very cool that he was the first black president. Obviously, I was the Palin thing moved McCain for me from like an 88 to like a 70 because if McCain died, then we were going to get a 2. So, you know, that pushed him and Obama closer together for me. And, you know, little did I know that I was very close in 2020 to having a choice between like a 2 and a 10 in Bernie and Trump, right? So all of a sudden, a 50 seemed pretty good. So I don't know. I think that especially if you look at, you know, my lifetime, I think, which is a better rating, and it's hard for me to even rate Reagan, but if you look at like H.W. Bush through the present day, I mean, I think you could make a good argument that Obama was the second best president behind my man H.W. Bush in that time frame. And I think that obviously, if you look at the last 2 Republican presidents, you know, W, who I have personal sympathies for, but obviously it made some massive errors that are far outside the range of Obama's modest errors. I don't think it's possible to rank Bush ahead of Obama, obviously. So, you know, I don't know about top 10 all time, but in my lifetime, he's the second, which isn't too bad. But that's mostly kind of grading on a curve because the other presidents have not been great.
James, you popped up as soon as I said I couldn't get you. So thanks for your question.
Thank you, Ben. I just wanted to say really quickly, everyone, hello. And Tim, I'm a big fan of yours, brother. I was watching you on Drinking and Talking. Do you remember that at all, man?
Drinking and Talking?
Stein show that you were on?
Oh my God. Yeah, I was in a dark emotional place when I did that podcast. So if people want to hear me at my lowest, you can go find that in the archives.
Well, I would say no. I would not say you came ever across like that. I was very surprised actually when I found out that you worked for Romney. after that discussion, because I was like, this guy's really nice. How could he for Mitt Romney? I always was a big fan of yours. I remember you.
Well, we lost James. Tony, this time for real, the floor is yours.
Looks like it. Hey, just quickly, not to make too light of it or in the subject matter.
That was not what I was expecting from Tony. So I'm going to read Tony's question as well.
But do it in that voice.
Yeah. What we are waiting for regarding economic. So what are we waiting for regarding economic sanctions against Putin and his cronies? Do we have to wait until Ukrainians are dying before we tell the oligarchs they can no longer access their US dollars and New York, London dachas? Should their kids still be attending Ivy League colleges? Tomas, is there any good reason for the hard line that the administration has taken on not doing these sanctions preemptively?
Not that I know of.
I mean, so you're sympathetic to Zelensky?
Yeah.
And the
yeah, I mean, I don't think you need, as I said earlier, you don't need to. In fact, I would argue you shouldn't impose them all at once, and you titrate them, as in chemistry. You know, like you do this, we do that, and you do this, and we do that. You stop doing that, we take this off. I mean, and so I mean, it's shaping their behavior. I think is the way to go, but certainly. You have to make them feel genuine pain, because otherwise it's kind of like, okay, yeah, well, we can live with that. And also, I mean, one reason they should target more the people who are, you should definitely target the people who are enjoying the West with a lot of money, with their yachts and their villas in southern France and, and mansions in London and,
can we house Ukrainian refugees in yachts and mansions seized from?
Well, that's one way of doing it. I had a piece about a month and a half ago yelling at the European Union for not taking into account the fact that Ukraine, borders on 4 EU countries, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. And that unlike all of the refugees, the 2.5 million who came in boats from Syria, they live on the borders of these, there's no sea. And on top of that, if you have a Ukrainian passport, you have visa-free travel to the EU. So
these are not defended borders.
You don't have to apply for asylum right away. I'm just coming for the weekend to Bialystok or something, right? I mean that's which is a lot different from you have to immediately apply for asylum and you're housed in some kind of warehouse somewhere in Lampedusa in southern Italy, in the island, but rather you're just coming legally across the border. That may change if but that of course would be kind of a bad news, like, oh no, we're going to scrap Ukraine's visa-free travel because they are refugees. But, this could range up to like millions of people. I mean, it really is a function of how bad it is and how far they go, because if they do a little bit in eastern Ukraine, then you're going to get a certain number. If they go all out on taking over Ukraine, you're going to have, you can imagine a quarter of the population fleeing.
And just for those who don't know, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe in geography, and it has 44 million people in it. It is a no joke large country. All right, last question goes to Zunyi, and then I have a important announcement. For President Ilves, how important is it to continue the Panama Papers and FinCEN investigations in order to root out the financial corruption in Russia and around the world? What do you make of Boris Johnson saying he will leak financial corruption in the UK if Putin invades, but not just leak it because it is the right thing to do? What do you make of it? Is the Anne Applebaum, this is all about corruption thesis
I tend
right?
to agree with it, but I would say that first of all, it's vital that these investigations keep going and the things become public. A, B, I was really flabbergasted by his statement, which is that if you invade, then we will do something. But if you don't invade, we'll all keep it quiet, which is
Right.
kind of the problem in the UK. So I was not thrilled by that statement.
The problem in London is that like half the city and all of its best real estate is empty because Russian oligarchs own it and use it like twice a year. All right. Tomas Ilves, you're a great Estonian. Tim Miller, you're a great American. Thanks for joining us. And I have a special announcement regarding Joel Woodward, who I just happened to have brought on the screen. On Friday, you will, those of you who were here on the show will remember that Joel showed up and lived up to his name, Joel the Nudge, and nudged me to get together with him and his wife, Brenda, and go cross-country skiing. Joel is, among other things, a former cross-country ski racer and head of coaching in the state of Minnesota. Is that right?
Yep.
And so I went out in the bitter Minnesota cold to a frozen lake to go cross-country skiing with Joel and Brenda, and it was a total delight. It was brutal. And I just wanted to say, follow up on the events of Cheese Night on Friday. Thank you, Joel, for taking me out into the frozen tundra north.
And I just have to say that you were a tremendous sport because 1, it was freezing, 2, there was wind, and the skiing conditions were horrible.
Well, it was good fun. I went out to Minnesota to do some speed skating and visit a baby. I did not go out to Minnesota to go cross-country skiing, but it was a delight, and it was super
It was
pleasure
super fun
to meet and Brenda, and let's do it again sometime.
Anytime you're in town, man.
All right. Thanks, Joel. And that brings us to the end of one of the most depressing shows I hope we're ever going to have. It's going to be, Scott's going to have to rewrite his book because like interstate war is back. It's going to create a lot of work for Scott and Ona Hathaway. And there's going to be civilian casualties associated with that work. It's also going to suck for lots of other reasons. We're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we will be back on Wednesday. And we actually have a show scheduled for Wednesday. So let me pull it up so that, Wednesday is the day that we are having Rabbi Danya Rutenberg on. She has done a lot of work on the history of anti-Semitism, a subject of which we've gotten several requests from the audience to do a show on. So she's going to join me and GDF Wednesday evening. And by then, with any luck, there will still be a sovereign nation of Ukraine. And until then, Scott Shapiro.
We can't have fun anymore, but we can have 2 new independent republics in the world, which is pretty bad. I would just simply say that like people who are dissing international law just point out that like we've had the like news about the president of the United States flush classified materials down the toilet. Which
domestic law is not looking so hot either.
Yeah, right, exactly. It is in the nature of law to have procedures for dealing with its violation. And so what I would hope is that despite the fact that there are severe violations of incredibly important rules, that the international community respond in a sober, constant, and resolute manner to this outrage.
And if you have a high power projector, there is this guy in Washington. He's one of my heroes. I forget his name though, who used to go around and project the text of the relevant constitutional provisions onto the Trump Hotel. And once he, the emoluments clause and it was beautiful. And so I think if you have a high power projector, they're pretty expensive, but I'm sure some of you have them. Go project blue and yellow onto the Russian embassy. It's like a big white marble building. It's almost like a movie screen. It's just asking for it. There's a hotel right across the street. I'll pay for the room. Just turn that thing blue and yellow. Yeah,